Hey everybody, in chapter 3 we're going to talk about media or the materials that artists use to make art. And can be a big subject in itself because of course there's lots of different materials, some are more traditional, but in contemporary art almost anything goes. So just to start out with, I can show you an example of that here. We have contemporary artist Simon Beck, who's a Swiss artist and is using snow as his medium. In fact, if we look at that little dot right there, that's Mr. Beck. So these are huge scale, and of course they're ephemeral, they're temporary. He can take a picture of it when he's done, but ultimately that thing will melt or blow away and it no longer exist. And here's Mr. Beck himself. After he's finished one, you can see he's got on some sort of modified snowshoes. So snow as an art form. If we look at the kind of traditional media that are used, and it's important to think about them being broken down in a particular way. So you have two-dimensional media, the flat kinds of things, drawing, painting, printmaking, which we'll talk about, photography, and assemblage, collage, or montage. You have three-dimensional media, so that would be things like ceramics, sculpture, fibers, and fibers. We've actually already seen two artists that would be considered fiber artists. Women of G's Bend making quilts, and Yoji Yamamoto making clothing. So those are both fibers that are three-dimensional. And then one thing that's important to understand is the idea of four-dimensional media, or another way to say it would be a time-based media. So these are things that, of course, we're very familiar with these days: film, video, animation, sound, and performance. The fourth dimension being time. So let's go back to this Marcus Aurelius equestrian statue. We talked about it before in the first week, but it's important to look at materials not just in terms of, one of the ways I like to think of it is the noun, horse, man, pedestal, but to think about what the materials themselves mean. That materials have meaning. If I scroll up to the Yorubu statue again, we can look at it. It's made out of carved wood, and it is approximately 71 inches high. So about the height of a adult human, made out of carved wood. When you start thinking about that, there's a few sort of telling things. This was a readily available material. Was probably the largest piece of material that they could get a hold of in that particular culture, in that part of the world. This statue the statue alone is 11 feet 6 inches tall, but then placed on a marble pedestal that's also probably another 6 or 7 feet tall. So you add all that together and you have a statue that's almost 20 feet tall. It's placed in a public area. It's meant to be kind of overwhelming and imposing. It's made out of bronze. It's a material that required a lot of manpower. Notice that there's no single artist attributed to this work because it was almost certainly the work of many people. You have to refine, or you have to create an original and make a casting from that original. Probably cast in several pieces and assembled. So this was the work of many people. And the materials that went into making this, marble was probably from Italy, but the other materials could have come from other parts of the world. The Roman Empire at its height was an enormous area. So this sculpture, in addition to depicting the man Marcus Aurelius sitting on a horse, is kind of a representation of the power of the Roman Empire to be able to make something out of these particular materials. Now, I'm not going to talk about every single traditional art medium, but I am going to touch on a couple of them. If you watched this clip, A Girl with the Pearl Earring, the movie based on a Johannes Vermeer painting by the same name, you see them in a scene where they're mixing paint, where she is learning to mix paint for him and looking at the various materials that they used at that time. Someone says they're an artist in our culture, I think is kind of a cliche that everybody assumes that they're a painter. Of course, not everybody's a painter. But painting in this period of time, and here's a word that you're going to hear and read many times, is the Renaissance. This was the beginning of the Renaissance period. So middle 1400s or middle of the 15th century. That anybody that was a painter couldn't simply go to a store and buy paint in tubes and start painting. Painted tubes didn't come along until the 19th century. So Vermeer had to know how to make his own paint, where to get the materials to do that. Something like this right here, burnt black, was very easy to get. It was probably burnt bone, which was readily available, but ruby shellac, vermilion, lapis, these are all rare minerals that may have come from great distances and might have been very expensive. So being a painter in the 15th century was actually a lot more complicated than it is today. I realize there's a lot of videos to watch this week, but I think it's important to understand particularly these printing processes. Here you see a depiction of Gutenberg, the inventor of movable type, and it's really hard to underestimate the significance of this invention. Before movable type, most people were illiterate. Most people never even had books in their lives. The printing press made literacy a reality, and all the things that came with it, universities, changes in economies and political systems. It really was a world-changing kind of invention. One of the questions I like to ask my students in class is, how many photographic images do you look at in a single day? In our culture, you really are a master consumer of photographic images, with Facebook, with Pinterest, with websites, with television. It's really not exaggerating to say that you could look at thousands of photographic images a day. So photography is really another game-changing kind of invention. It's something that really shapes our world today significantly. If you try to imagine what it would be like to not have photographs in your life, or that the only place to see them would be in a museum, it's hard to comprehend that because it's so intertwined into our lives. So that's partly why we're going to do a whole section on photography towards the end of the semester. I think it's really important to understand the history of photography and its place in our culture. the last thing I want to mention is this idea of four-dimensional media or time-based media. Again, it's really prevalent in our culture today. We look at a lot of four-dimensional media on a daily basis. In a fine art context, it might be a little bit different. Your impression of Laurie Simmons' The Music of Regret might be that it's a little strange, but you know, her primary purpose isn't to entertain, it's to make you think. So she's using a four-dimensional medium. She's using performance, these puppets, their songs, so there's sound, they're being filmed, and think about the meaning of this. You know, she's referring to things like maybe soap operas or children's programming. These are things that are part of our life, and she's using it to tell this little story about these people's lives. So it's a really good example of a contemporary artist using four-dimensional media. And you see in the video that she started out as a two-dimensional artist. She made still videos, and she realized as she went on that she maybe wasn't being able to say everything she wanted to say with two-dimensional media, and was able to do that when she brought them to life with motion and sound.